All right. Um, this is a story called Mr. Blackburn. He could feel her eyes on his back as he hung the coats, fumbling with the hangers. It felt like an eternity, and all the while she stood watching silently. When he was done, he turned to look at her. Even without heels on, she was still taller than him. She was taller than most people, though, thin and elegant, with long brown hair and bright red lips. She stood there, looking back at him, heels in one hand and head slightly cocked. "Shall we have some wine?" she said, in the same high voice. Mr. Blackburn nodded. It wasn't even a question, it was a demand. Get the wine. The door to the wine cellar was unlocked. It always was that way. She always wanted wine when she came home from a night out. When Mr. Blackburn returned with the bottle, she was seated at the little wooden table in the kitchen, straight backed and poised, her wrists on the table, her fingertips touching. Even through the Scotch-induced haze, he saw it coming. It was always the same. But how could he refuse this extraordinary woman? She waited until he was seated opposite her before she uncorked the bottle and filled both their glasses. Mr. Blackburn watched the crimson liquid escape the bottle. He noticed his glass was slightly more filled than hers. It was a minuscule difference, and accidental, he told himself. She put the bottle down and smiled at him. Perfect teeth. "So I've been considering, with the expense of my trip, and the expense of the Bradsons party, and not to mention the whole fiasco in Milan, You need more money." For a moment there was a hardness in her eyes, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She bowed her head and looked up at him and smiled, shyly, almost, with both of her hands grasping the long stem of the half-empty wineglass. How quickly she could change her demeanor when she wanted to. "Oh, no. Well, I suppose yes, but I just think it would be prudent, wise even, to transfer maybe the smallest amount, just to cover the costs of any emergency, and anyways, after the success of the first one, Eileen Bradson mentioned there might be another, and you know how big their house is, and after all, there is his dress I've—" Mr. Blackburn sat motionless in the wooden chair, with his hands in his lap. His wineglass stood untouched. This was not an unfamiliar act. He watched her as she spoke. All the girlish desire in this young woman became apparent. She smiled sweetly at him. Both of them knew already that he would provide her with the money. This was a charade, a private act between two people who both knew the final scene. But what could he do? Already he suspected her of seeing other men. This was not the first time she arrived home far later than expected, and each time he worried more. She wasn't talking anymore, just looking at him, with a slight smile on the corner of her mouth. "I will transfer the money," he said quietly. "Excellent," she said, standing up and leaving her wineglass on the table. Mr. Blackburn remained in his chair, motionless for a very long while. When he finally stood up, his legs were stiff, and the effect of the alcohol had worn off. He heaved a sigh and poured himself another glass of scotch. On his way back to the living room, he paused to look up the stairs. It was dark on the landing, and no light shone through the cracks of the closed bedroom door. She was already asleep. A closed door meant he would sleep alone tonight, by the fire again, or perhaps in the spare room. He imagined her lying there in the enormous four-poster bed, complete with, at her request, a flowered white canopy. Mr. Blackburn frowned. There was a faint smell of smoke in the air. The fire on the hearth was nearly out, and was well contained. He took one step up the stairs, then another. The smell of burning material became stronger as he approached the bedroom door. Mr. Blackburn opened the door cautiously. For a moment he stood in the doorframe. Two bodies lay intertwined in the bed, their eyes closed, their noses almost touching. The bottle of wine that Mr. Blackburn had himself so recently uncorked lay empty by their feet, along with another, unfamiliar bottle. The man was young and clean-shaven. There was a little pool of spittle on the bed directly beneath his slightly agape mouth. It was her left hand that caught his attention, though. It hung lazily off the side of the bed, and held a lit cigarette. Both of their clothes were strewn across the floor, but it was her dress that had caught fire. Before his eyes the dress was vanishing as the fire chewed its way through the thin white satin. The flame had reached the foot of the bed. Soon that too would be aflame, and still Mr. Blackburn stood frozen in the doorway. The room smelled of expensive perfume and ash. The fire had now completely surrounded the bed, and suddenly she was awake and screaming. To Mr. Blackburn the sound of her voice seemed somehow dull and diminished, while the roar of the fire was amplified. From the door he watched her scramble to the head of the bed. She was trapped. The bedroom wall at her back, and the ever-growing wall of fire in front of and around her. The man lay unconscious and unmoved. She saw him then, framed in the doorway. He saw the terror etched across her face, and the hysteric panic in her voice as she screamed for help. He looked her directly in the eye, and as he did so, he saw something change in her face. He saw the realization dawn on her. He saw the fury on her face as he turned her back and closed the door. In the spare room, he found a wooden chair, which he wedged firmly against the bedroom door before ascending the stairs. Her screams followed him all the way into the kitchen. The whole house reeked of burning material now. Mr. Blackburn poured himself another glass of scotch and drained it in one go. He found his warm boots and gloves in the closet and donned a heavy coat. He left through the same door she entered in hours earlier, but not before pocketing the bottle of scotch. It was bitterly cold outside, and freshly falling snow would quickly cover the footprints he left on the white ground. Mr. Blackburn walked until he was nearly at the top of the hill that sat north of his house. From his vantage point, he could see the lights of the town glimmering from under snow-covered roofs. Brightest and closest of all was his own house, which was now fully engulfed by the fire. Bright spires of flame reached high up into the dark night. Mr. Blackburn took off his jacket and gloves and sat in the snow and watched the house burn to the ground. He hadn't brought a glass, so he drank directly from the bottle instead. He began to feel warm, and his limbs began to tingle. For the second time this evening, his eyes began to droop. He took off his drool-stained black shirt and made a pillow, on which he leaned back and rested his head. Through his half-shut eyes, he could still see the orange glow of the burning house. He thought he heard the faint sound of far-off sirens, but he couldn't be sure. Mr. Blackburn smiled to himself and closed his eyes fully. So, let's see. One of the main things I researched when writing this story was the poem Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. And I've really liked this poem ever since I heard it for the first time. And I just kind of wanted to not retell it, because there's not a lot really in the poem to retell, but kind of recreate that sort of atmosphere that was created by Robert Frost in that poem. So a lot of the elements that were included in that poem I tried to include in my story, not as a direct linear representation, but more of like the atmosphere and the feelings that poem evoked. I tried to do the same in my story. So that was not along the lines of verisimilitude at all. I didn't really gain any factual information or accurate detail-oriented accuracy from that. It was more just the concept of the story. Another story I researched that really helped me a lot was the story Cathedral by Raymond Carver. And this was more along the lines of verisimilitude. I kind of just wanted to know how you could write about two adults in a situation, and it just so happened that alcohol played a part in both my story and the story of the Cathedral. So that was useful to look at and analyze. And one thing I did learn specifically from, or one thing I did incorporate specifically from that story, is the lack of dialogue. A lot of that story is told through just narrative instead of dialogue, and I try to do the same thing. There's not a lot of talking in my story, even though I think in real life, if that situation occurred and a fire happened, there would be a lot more dialogue. But so that's kind of where I edged away from believability in the favor of just an interesting, hopefully interesting story. One thing I did, I looked up completely for verisimilitude, was the IKEA website, and I wanted to know about, or what the four-poster beds that are available nowadays, although I'm not entirely sure if this story is set nowadays, but what the four-poster beds that are available look like, and if you can actually have a canopy, that sort of thing. And if a bed caught fire, would you be trapped on it, and that sort of thing, to kind of create that the climactic scene in my story accurately. So that was the IKEA website. I looked into that a bit. I also looked at MayoClinic.com, which is a medical website, and I looked a lot about alcoholism and hypothermia. And I wanted to know how cold and what sort of temperatures it needs to be for someone to die of hypothermia. And it turns out that it doesn't have to be very cold at all, actually. And it's actually just about length of exposure rather than how cold it is. And I also looked about the effects of alcohol on someone who's exposed to cold to try and make a scene that was believable as well as realistic in context of the story. Um, yeah, that's a lot of the research I did. I read a lot of other stories, a lot of other short stories that don't really have any direct bearing on what I wrote, but they help me organize my thoughts and come up with a structure for my story, because oftentimes I feel like it's easy to write a story, but it's not really to write an ending or to give it a sort of like crux or anything. So I looked at a bunch of Edgar Allan Poe stories to kind of see how he um, created interest in his stories. And yeah, thank you.